look at all of the reforms that the various folks around the country are trying to implement, this consent decree Baltimore City really is a very forward-looking document that essentially encapsulates just a version of reform that folks are talking about. In terms of use of force, also in terms of making sure that stop, search, and arrest are constitutional, how to deal with folks who have behavioral disorders, and how the police should essentially interact with them. So I think we have a very good blueprint here to work from. Now, whether BPD will be in compliance remains to be seen. I think that, some good steps in some areas, other steps not very well, but overall, we have a blueprint to work from. The other thing that I'll quick, that when you look at the consent decree, I mentioned earlier, is a very document. Well, it does echo that many community have talked about when they're saying we need to reimagine how the police department does its work. And so, just real quick, by way of example, I mean, there was this consent decree spends a lot of time addressing those activities that police may not have to respond to when they're dealing with folks who have behavioral disorders or in some crisis. And so we can talk about that tonight, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it now. Let me turn it over to Seth, and I'm going to ask Seth to talk about two things. First, I'd like him to kind of bring folks up to date in terms of where we are with the pandemic and what progress we make over the summer. And I'd also like him to discuss real briefly where we are in terms of how we are assessing where BPD is at this time. So Seth, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, just briefly. As those of you who are tuning in know, the pandemic has had an effect on the progress of the consent decree, as it's had an effect on every other aspect of society. But the effect has not been as great as you might imagine. The police department is moving forward, and the city is moving forward with a number of the deliverables that they're required to produce under the existing, which is now the third-year monitoring plan. And so, we are getting things, and things are being filed under the third-year monitoring plan. The biggest area where we saw some delay and have seen some delays in the area of training, which was going very well. The department had started its training on critical training, consent decree training on stops, searches, and arrests. The department's history of unjustified and unlawful stop, searches, and arrests is one of the main reasons they're under a consent decree. And one of the main reasons their relationship with the community is fractured. And so that training had begun. BPD had done the first 5 weeks that covered about 20% of the department in February and early March. And then because of the pandemic, had to shut down the academy for about 4 months. It did reopen the academy and restarted stop, searches, and arrest training in July. There was then there was actually an outbreak in a recruit class at the academy. They were able to get that under control, and they restarted training a couple of weeks ago on stop, searches, and arrests. So that has begun, and there are a number of different training programs that are now in various stages of development. And so for one, ethical policing is courageous training is being developed right now and should be delivered later in the year. That training is critical. That is training on what police professionals call active bystandership, meaning that officers are being trained not simply to stand by passively if fellow officers are about to engage in misconduct or are engaging in misconduct, but are instead being trained to prevent misconduct before it happens by intervening, or by intervening after misconduct has begun to stop it dead in its tracks and to report officers for engaging in that misconduct. Commissioner Harrison views that as critical training. We, the monitoring team, view it as critical training. The Department of Justice views it as critical training. Other training programs that are about to get underway, including training department-wide on behavioral health awareness and training on responding to reports of sexual assault. That training should begin this fall and should be delivered department-wide. There will be e-learning delivered on First Amendment protected activities training, obviously critical right now, given protests that are happening across the country and continue to happen in Baltimore. And there will also be training that's being developed on community policing and on fair and impartial policing. So all that training is in development now and will be put out to the community for comment, will be refined, will be pilot tested, and will be delivered over the course of the next year. So that stuff is going forward, though it has been delayed to a degree by the pandemic. Other things are moving forward. For instance, the investigations and intake manual for the Public Integrity Bureau, which does misconduct investigations, is just about complete. The department has been working vigorously on those. There are other policies, like a policy on procedural justice and interactions, basically treating people fairly, that is currently out for public comment, that the department has been working on. There are other policies as well that continue. Importantly, BPD also has begun the process of self-assessment in certain areas, and those self-assessments, those audits that BPD is conducting on its own and that we will be reviewing is underway. So BPD, for instance, is taking a look at arrests that were made, but the people were released. The people who were arrested were released soon after without charge. And BPD is self-assessing whether there are things that went wrong with those arrests, whether those arrests may have been unlawful and were made without probable cause, which might be the reason that the state's attorney's office decided to dismiss the charges. In addition, the department just completed an annual look back at First Amendment protected activity in the department's response to First Amendment protected activity over the course of the last year. That report was filed with the court earlier in the summer. And the department also has been taking a look, continues to take a look at transport events, whether it is abiding by the new policies regarding transporting people in custody, and whether there's also self-assessments going on with respect to whether BPD is responding appropriately to reports of sexual assault. So all of those things are continuing unaffected by the pandemic. But like I said, there are certain things that have been affected by the pandemic because the training academy had to shut down, and because certain staff who were deployed otherwise during the pandemic weren't able to continue working on certain consent decree deliverables for a period of several weeks. So that's sort of the long and short of what's been happening with the reform effort during the pandemic. On the issue of the monitoring team's own assessments, we completed a comprehensive qualitative assessment of misconduct investigations for the year 2018, and we'll be producing our report at the end of September, so in about a month and a half. We're about to start our first comprehensive look at use of force incidents, use of force reporting, and use of force supervisory review. That is about to get underway. We're hoping to conclude that initial comprehensive compliance review by the end of the year, and should be producing a report sometime in the first quarter of 2021. We're also going to be taking a look beginning in the next month or so and continuing through the fall and into the winter at the quality of BPD's investigations of reports of sexual assault. So we'll be looking at that. And then we're working with what we call our outcome assessment team, our statisticians, to determine whether or which areas under what is paragraph 459 of the consent decree we're going to be able to be conducting quantitative assessments, really looking at BPD data and determining quantitatively where BPD stands along the arc of compliance. We're going to be starting to do that in the next month or so, and we'll be producing our first of these outcome assessments under paragraph 459 of the consent decree probably within the next 6 months. So that gives you a preliminary idea of what we're doing with respect to assessing where BPD is along the arc of compliance. And let me just add this before we turn it over back to Ray and your questions. We are beginning these assessments in earnest now, because it is only now, when BPD has finished the vast majority of its policy revisions and is beginning to conduct training, has already conducted some training, but is beginning to conduct other training on these new policies. Given the state, really the undesirable state of BPD's data, it has been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to begin conducting outcome assessments. And because we've been focusing our time and attention on policies and on training, we haven't focused as much time on these compliance reviews, because the compliance reviews really aren't that worthwhile prior to the training taking place. So this is sort of the next phase of the monitoring process that we are embarking upon. We really started with the misconduct investigations assessment over the course of the last year, but we'll really be ramping up over the course of the next 6 months to a year. Ken?
Thank you, Seth. Ray, you want to open it up for questions?
Yeah, I think unless you want to add something, I think Seth said a lot. So let's pause. Let's pause and see if anybody has any questions about the training and the monitoring plan as far as implementation goes right now, and kind of recap some of what Seth added. Any questions so far, D?
We don't have a question on training or anything, but we do have a question from one of our NLs, Wanda Watts. Her question was, how often does policy procedures section under the transparency BPD section get updated? Finalized policies are listed as draft.
I'll go ahead and answer that, Ken, if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's a good question, Wanda. So policies can be finalized, but they remain in draft form until training has occurred department-wide on those policies, right? You can't really hold officers accountable to policies until they've been trained on them. So it may well be that BPD, for instance, has completed most, if not all, of its policies on stop, searches, and arrests, but those policies still appear as draft policies on BPD's transparency page because BPD has yet to complete department-wide training on those policies. So it's only after training is completed that the policies become final and move from the draft policies page on BPD's transparency website to the active policies page.
That was a good question. Anything else? I mean, that was a lot. There was a talk about now that the trainings are happening at University of Baltimore. I personally would like to know, Seth, is the COVID-19 regulations and restrictions affecting the timeline for this training now that it's resumed, or are they full classes, or how is that structure happening as they move forward?
Yeah, good question, Ray. So one of the reasons why the completion of the training has to be delayed is due to COVID restrictions. BPD has had to reduce the class size, for instance, in its stop, searches, and arrest training. So the original plan was for each classroom to have 36 officers, with 6 officers stationed around 6 tables within the classroom, engaged in problem solving and proactive facilitated discussion and learning. That has become more difficult in the age of COVID, and so what you have now are, rather than 36 member size classes, you've got 24 member size classes, and the level of interaction, although it is still what it was supposed to be, not everybody can sit around the same table and talk. I think there are basically 2 officers at each long table, and then they try to get groups of 6 officers at 3 different long tables, essentially in these classrooms, engaging in discussions to try to solve problems that are presented to them during the training and to provide feedback to the facilitated discussion. So It is a little more difficult than it was pre-COVID, but it's still happening. It's still happening largely the way it should. It's interesting. BPD, after each session, so these are 2-day trainings, and at the end of each 2-day training session, BPD's Academy asks officers who just completed the training to fill out surveys about the training. And the response so far in stop searches and arrest training has been overwhelmingly positive. Between 80 and 85% of all officers have found the training engaging and believe that at the end of training, they have no questions about how to apply the policies. There are only a very small percentage, really around 5%, who say that the training, even during the age of COVID, is not engaging. But there is, in some of the narrative portions of the comments, they do say that they wish the training was even more interactive than it can be under COVID, and COVID is placing some restrictions on the training that are less than ideal. That said, the department knows that it has to move forward with the training because, reform needs to continue to proceed apace, and we just cannot afford, the department cannot afford to wait until there's a vaccine to restart training. It's just not practicable.
Let me add one thing, Seth, which is pretty close to what you said. There's nothing good that anybody can say about this pandemic. However, with respect to this area of stop, search, and arrest, I think we found that when we had that initial delay, based on the comments that we were getting back from the officers who were in the training classes, I think we were able to help BPD to, I won't use the word perfect, but they were able to polish and to make better some of the curricula. And I think what Seth is saying in terms of the survey, I think overall, most of the officers, I understand it, are very happy with the training. They would like more interactive training, and I think that makes sense. But I think overall, the training is quite good. The trainers are good. They've brought in a number of civilians who really know what they're doing. And so I think, while this COVID delay has certainly caused problems in an area that we look at as being critical to the reform process, at the same time, sometimes when you have a delay, if you make good use of it, you get a better product. And I would say that's what happened here.
We have another question from another NL, Miss Elvonia Allen. She asks, what is being done to bring on mental health providers when responding to emergency situations?
I'll take that one, Seth. This whole area of mental health and police interaction with folks who are in crisis, we've been focused on it really from the beginning. And obviously the event that took place last month in early July with Mr. Walker, has certainly heightened our attention. What we are requiring the city to do is to basically do a check of the inventory. They need to figure out, what mobile crisis teams are available, what crisis centers are available 24/7, so that everybody knows if there is an event where perhaps a police officer, maybe he or she needs to be called, but you can benefit from a mental health provider or a social worker. We have to be certain that that infrastructure is in place. So it is incredibly important. And this is going on right now with the city solicitor has essentially taken this on as her number one priority right now is to, well, I shouldn't say that because she's got a lot of priorities, but among her priorities, of course, is to try to figure out, just what resources are available. We are not certain, exactly what the number are, whether they can arrive, within the time frame when there's a call for service. So these things have to be looked at. But this is a really, really good question, and it's being looked at very carefully now, and it's being spearheaded by our subject matter expert, Dr. Randy DuPont, who really is the national expert on this subject.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Lori Stewart, a resident. She asks, does the court have power to address items in the 2019 to 2021 police union contract with BPD that may hinder or interfere with community trust and attitudes towards BPD police?
It's a really good question. It's not an easy answer. The union contracts, just like state law, do carry a certain amount of authority. I suspect if there was something in the union contract that was contrary to something in the consent decree, the consent decree would probably prevail. But we have to wait to see if someone's going to raise those issues. I mean, right now, it's the union contract is an issue, but also we have state law, which is an issue. And of course, state law right now in terms of transparency and some other issues and, what public information is available is controlled by state law. So the consent decree pretty much works within the confines of state law. In terms of the union contracts, like I said, I'm not really, I'd have to look at a specific case and Seth, you may have a better example, because I can't think of anything right now where the union contract necessarily conflicts with the consent decree, because if it did, I suspect, the consent decree would prevail.
Okay, thank you. Wanda Watts, our NL has another question. What, if any, marketing dollars are being spent by the department to educate the community and their own officers? Difficult getting buy-in when officers do not understand this is not a punishment, but a hand up.
Seth, you want to take that?
Danielle, can you read the first part of that question again? I'm not sure I totally heard it.
Okay. What, if any, marketing dollars are being spent by the department to educate the community and their own officers?
I don't exactly know what the public relations budget of BPD is. I mean, they obviously have a public relations budget. They have a public relations officer. They have recruiting videos that they've produced that talk about, a new department and the biggest comeback or the best comebacks, greatest comeback story ever. And, they do they do engage in community outreach to try to tell folks what's going on under the consent decree in order to try to get community to participate, whether it's to comment on policies or comment on training curriculum or what have you. So, there's obviously people who are doing that work, and, the people who are doing that work get paid a salary. And, you have to pay for the marketing as well. But I really don't know what the actual budget is. In terms of the officers, there is a concerted effort being made by BPD to inform officers what the consent decree and the revised policies under the consent decree require. And that happens not just through formal training, but it also happens through roll calls, because, at the beginning of every officer's shift, they go through roll call, and the lieutenant who, is the commander in charge of that shift will conduct roll call training. Some of that roll call training has to do with consent decree issues. There's also notices that go out over the police department's online system called Power DMS. And so officers are getting updates about what's happening under the consent decree and what they really need to know. And most recently, with our approval and the Justice Department's approval, the department produced what's called a pocket guide of BPD's key policies for patrol officers. And these are the policies that are key under the consent decree too. So it's this sort of short summary little pamphlet that really highlights what's important under revised BPD policies and therefore what's important under the consent decree. And it's really sort of a handy little thing. Last, they have put marketing dollars, again, this is stuff that comes out over Power DMS, marketing dollars or money, I don't call it marketing dollars, towards producing videos that train officers on key areas or key policies that have been revised under the consent decree and that have raised questions for officers. So a recent example are level 1 uses of force. That's the most minimum level of use of force, but it still requires officers to produce a report, and it still requires supervisors to review that use of force, and the paperwork surrounding it. So they created a video, BPD has created a video which tells officers and gives certain real life examples about what is what's called a reportable level 1 use of force, meaning something that is in fact a level 1 use of force and thus must be reported by officers and reviewed by supervisors. And what is it? And there are certain things that do qualify and certain things that don't. So for instance, simply handcuffing somebody does not qualify as a reportable level 1 use of force, right? If the suspect being handcuffed, being arrested, offers no resistance, but if the arrestee is offering some resistance, and in order to get the arrestee in handcuffs, the officer has to use some kind of compliance hold, even though it doesn't cause any kind of permanent, any kind of lasting pain. The fact that the officer had to go hands-on and had to exert at least some force, even if it was minimal force, to get the arrestee in handcuffs, that is a reportable level 1 use of force. And so the video that BPD has produced, with its dollars and is now disseminated or will be disseminating over Power DMS, shows the distinction with play actors between those two examples, what's reportable on the one hand and what's not reportable on the other.
Let me add that because in addition to educating police officers, BPD also has an obligation under the consent decree to essentially engage with the community, not only educate, but to provide the information to the community so that they understand what's going on during this consent decree process. And while it's not directly related to your question, Ms. Watts, I think it's relevant enough that it bears some discussion. It is incredibly important that BPD do its outreach, not only with police officers, but with folks in the community so that folks understand exactly what they're doing at any particular place in time. Now, obviously the pandemic has certainly caused a fair amount of disruption, but thanks to, and it may have been your question, Ms. Watts, that Darnell and Ray brought to the monitoring team's leadership a couple of weeks ago, we went to BPD, to the compliance unit, and said to them, not that anybody was suggesting that they were not working on this area, but we recognized that they needed to provide even more what's the word I'm looking for, more energy into engaging with the public so that folks in the community would understand what's going on at any particular time. So I think I'll give our neighborhood liaison a lot of credit for getting that back on the table. And I listened to Ray and Darnell tonight, and it appears that process is working and that the department is re-engaged and that they are re-energized and that they are taking the steps that they can take, recognizing the limitations that the pandemic puts us in, but we're moving along in that area.
And before we move to the next question, Darnell, I would like Ray to comment on this because Ray is probably more in touch with the folks at BPD who are engaged in community outreach than me and Ken are on a day-to-day basis. So I'm interested in hearing about Ray's view on what's being done and the adequacy of what's being done so far on community outreach by BPD.
So we won't point out a reason why, but we recognize that BPD's messaging or dissemination of information has been lacking since the beginning of this year. So we've been constantly trying to figure out how we can give those same type of messaging without crossing that boundary of what our role is. So we've been kind of working closely to make sure that when we do know, we can let people know. But the pandemic kind of shook all the dates. So I think that's a hanging point. But like Ken said, there is a new equity officer now with BPD, Bill Joyner. So we've been in conversation for about a month. Like Ken said, we had this issue brought up by Darnell and the liaisons once again last week, 2 weeks ago on our community engagement call. So Bill Joyner kind of pulled in CDIU once again to have a chronological strategy that they can share with us, and we'll leverage our neighborhood liaisons and their relationships in the community to kind of increase the outreach of the BPD. We had this moment in time where BPD focused on in-reach, and that kind of got lost in community where none of us were really getting that information, but we are strategizing. We have a formal plan on the plate, forwarded it to Seth so we can make sure there's no conflict and everyone's role is in alignment. But it's good to see that that work is actually still happening. And we know it's a pandemic. There isn't a lot of direct engagement. So we have to get more creative to ensure that that message is getting out there.
Thank you. Thank you. On the topic of community engagement, I have a question from Markel Kelly, and she asks, what trainings, if any, will be offered and available to the police officers on better community engagement?
Seth?
Sure, I'll start with that. So I mentioned, Markel, at the outset that BPD is in the process of developing community policing training. They are developing that now. We have not yet seen a first draft of that training. We're hoping to see a first draft in the next little while. We're actually going to be talking about that training with folks at the academy a little bit tomorrow morning. But that training is supposed to be developed over the course of the next several months and supposed to be delivered at some time in the first or second quarters of next year, department-wide. It's a critical training, so I'm glad you brought up the question. There are a lot of things that have to be part of that training. One is that, one of the things that we think we're going to insist on, or insisting on, is that, community members co-facilitate that training. So community members actually have to be brought into the process of piloting that training and ultimately delivering that training at the academy. That's going to be something relatively new for BPD. And so, it will pose a challenge, but it's something that's absolutely critical to this process of restoring the community's trust, which is to say you need to get the community involved in community policing training. There is a difference between, let me say this, between community policing and community engagement. And, my fellow deputy monitor, Chuck Ramsey, former police chief in both DC and Philly, always make sure to point this out, because community policing is, the strategy of having officers on the street and engaging, being out on the street and engaging with community members in order to stop crime before it happens and in order to be able to solve crime when it does. Community engagement is a little different. It's a precursor to community policing. It's making sure that police officers, are, and the police department in general is, reaching out to the community and making sure that they are engaged in the reform process itself. That's what we mean by community engagement under the consent decree. So the two things are a little bit different, although they obviously go hand in hand. Ray, I don't know if you've got anything else to add on community policing training, but that's at least what's happening on the ground right now. It's that training is in development, and we're hoping that it is able to be delivered in the early part of next year.
Right, and I think for community engagement, that also plays into what you said, Seth, about the EPIC program coming into play as well. They're all kind of in line, and I don't know. I'm with you. That's the schedule of it all. It was initially looking to have that training out by November, but of course, pandemic. So I think that's the point where people will be able to say that we see some of the reflections from the consent decree, and also the community policing plan incorporates more focused neighborhood policing plans, which will actually have small group conversations and more direct neighborhoods within a district to make sure that neighborhoods are policed according to their priorities. And also that kind of gives those officers the opportunity to get that cultural training direct from the indigenous population.
You know, we had a chat, I don't know, yesterday or day before yesterday about community policing and the idea that it's important that as we roll out, or as BPD rolls out the policing plan, that it reflects, you know, some of the concerns that the public nationally, and of course, more importantly in Baltimore City, are talking about when you try to figure out, you know, when should a police officer arrive, and when he or she arrives, what should they do, if anything. And of course, that's part of while this whole idea of and I'm referring primarily to interactions with people who have a behavioral crisis, while that's covered clearly in other aspects of the consent decree. And as I said before, this is one of the beauties of this consent decree, because I mean, 3 years ago when this contract was essentially being drafted, you know, it envisioned reimagining the police department in some ways. But part of the community policing plan will, in all likelihood, also adopt some of the issues that have been raised over the last few months, and it will be incorporated in the community policing plan. Because, you know, at the heart of the consent decree is, and while Seth has clearly made it, he's correct when he says there's a distinction between community engagement and community policing. At the end of the day, you know, what we're striving to do is to rebuild trust between the department and the community. And of course, in order to do that, in order for the community policing to have any effect, you're going to have good community engagement, so that folks, you know, develop some level of trust with the police officers that are sworn to protect their community. So it's important, you know, that the policing plan reinvent itself in some respects in real time. So I wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you. So I got a couple of statements before my next question. Lori Stewart, on the question that you answered, Ken, she said, great point about state law as well. I'm thinking about officer accountability. Thanks for your response. And Markel said, thank you for your time and response. Our next question comes from Damian J. Cooper. I know that brother. Good brother. Would the consent decree monitoring team be open to having a discussion with an organization like Project Numa that has been doing work with the BPD for years in the area of youth and community engagement? I can answer that one, but I'll let you know if y'all want to.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, sure. So, Damien, yes, sir, we would be open to having a conversation with Project Numa on that. We are actually open to have a conversation with anyone when it comes to the consent decree. That's what the community engagement team and my NLs do. No matter what time when you want to have it, you just get in contact. I'll get in contact with you, and we can set up a time where I can come through, and I can also, when we come up with some dates and times, can get Seth, Ken, and or Ray to join with us to have that conversation with your organization that I know you've been doing great work in the community. So yes, we can definitely, we're open to having that discussion.
What's the brother's name, Darnell?
Damian J. Cooper. He's the CEO of Project Numa.
And let me just add in, hey Coop, I know Coop too, and the group CCLP, the Center for Children's Law and Policy, is actually currently setting up some focus groups. So they were appointed through the court to do the assessment on youth and police interactions. So they've written their report, and they're getting ready to draft recommendations. So I know that they're trying to set up focus groups. So I'll make sure I pass your information along to them, and they'll reach out too.
Well, Damien, one of the things that I have made clear from day one, and this goes back to when we first started our work in the early part of 2018, was that, we invite anybody who has any idea, because at the end of the day, we do not profess to know it all. We do our best. We have a team of experts that are very, very good. I want to brag about, my group, which I think is probably the best in the country. But having said that, it is incredibly important that we get feedback from the community, and in particular, the local community. So any feedback that you have, any ideas that you have, you should feel not only free, but we beg you to come to the table to discuss these ideas, because, a lot of what has gone on with policies and training, a lot of the good stuff has come about because of discussions, we've had with the public. They've come in, they've watched some of the pilots in the training, and they've made suggestions. And in many cases, same thing with policies. And those suggestions have resulted in better policies and better training. And so I think it is, I can't repeat it enough to say that, getting feedback from the public is undoubtedly one of the best things that we look forward to as we move forward in this process.
Let me just add that, Damon, your question and your offer to, get involved is really timely, because it really is right now in the wake of that youth interactions and youth diversion assessment that Ray mentioned, that BPD is undertaking a process of revising its core policies on youth interactions. It's already revised some, but it's really sort of looking right now at the core policy on youth interactions. And next year, probably towards the end of the year, we'll be delivering training on youth interactions, but we'll be developing training curriculum in the earlier part of the year. So I think your voice and the voices of folks in your group are particularly important to that process. I would also note that the subject matter expert on our team is Kevin Bethel, who's up in Philadelphia. And Kevin's great, and we should definitely rope him in to any conversation that you want to have with us.
Great. Thank you very much. Got another question from Lori Stewart. She said, does this team know of any community research to be conducted as a follow-up to Morgan State's community experience and perception of BPD survey report to be able to analyze the efficacy of the plan on community perceptions, experiences, and attitudes toward BPD?
Great question, and Seth, you're on that right now.
Yeah. So to be clear, that Morgan State survey is our survey. We were working in partnership with Morgan State, to do that survey. So that is our survey. It was our inaugural or first community survey. We're actually in the process of developing a follow-up community survey, also to be conducted by Morgan State, looking at the very same things. The survey may be a little bit different because I think it's going to cover the same questions, but it is going to be a little more, I guess I would say, methodologically rigorous to make sure that the sample that Morgan State is going to be surveying represents a cross-section of the community. I mean, the first survey that Morgan State did absolutely represented a cross-section of the community in a very important way, and tells a very important story about community perceptions about the police. But they're going to be doing another survey that is a little more methodologically rigorous in the coming months. Actually, the idea was to start data collection as early as September for the next round of community survey, but because of the pandemic, that may end up having to be delayed. But to answer your question directly, there will be a second community survey that follows up on the first, and there will be a third community survey that follows up on the second, also conducted by Morgan State, and a fourth and a fifth until this consent decree is over, because the idea is to measure any changes in community perceptions of BPD performance over time, right? And so you want to use the same methodology with the same questions, with the same cross-section of the community, at various points in time to determine whether there are changes in attitudes towards the BPD. So that's the planning going forward. And you should hear something hopefully in the next month or so about our plans for this second iteration of the community survey that Morgan State's going to do with us.
Thank you. So I have a couple of statements. First statement is Cassie Boykin, another one of our NLs. She said, sending a thank you to Commander Harrison and Brian Nadal for asking legislators to help bring about police reform, more accountability post George Floyd, to change the law to make it easier to fire or discipline rogue and criminal police officers, to counter the policies now on the books on how officers are investigated for misconduct. I look forward to the session in January to bring this to fruition and move forward to revise the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. This bill, as it stands, makes it more difficult to punish bad officers and is not transparent enough. These changes, coupled with community engagement and other implementations, are imperative to Baltimore's consent decree framework and make us a good and useful case study. Thank you, Cassie. Damian Cooper said, thank you. Would you please let Ken know that he wants you to know that he was also a part of the consent decree process while he was in City Hall. And he sees it from a larger perspective and a larger spectrum. He's also not sure if Ken knows that we work inside of the academy with the police officer trainees. This started before the Freddie Gray uprising.
Thank you.
And let me see, I think Ms. Alvonia had a question. Will there be any dollars for public awareness in regards to the NLs and what we're here for, et cetera? Meaning, is there going to be any, I guess, again, marketing dollars put aside to talk about more what the NLs do, what they're out here doing, public awareness to what they're doing on both sides, BPD and the monitoring team, just to be able to, so people to know more about that there are NLs out here doing the work and can make them more visible.
Yes, Seth handles the budget, but let me say this as the lead monitor. I mean, my view on this is this is a responsibility that I want to lay at the feet of BPD and the city. I think that, you know, they need to find the dollars to promote not only their NLs, but to some extent, and again, within, we want to make sure people understand there's a difference between our NLs and the BPD NLs, but at the same time, you know, whatever information, whatever education that can go out to the public so they understand what the NLs are doing, I'm all for. I mean, obviously we have a very, very tight budget. It's difficult for us to do much within the budget that we have. That's not to say that if someone has some specific ideas, you know, you should sit down and talk to Seth and I, and we'll see what we can do. But I think this is a responsibility that I primarily put on the city and BPD. And that's one of the reasons why when you, Darnell, brought to our attention 2 weeks ago that we needed a little more energy from BPD, that's when I went to them. And so, you know, if you have some ideas in terms of how you would like this to roll out, let us know. And between Seth and I, we'll see what we can do. Seth, you may want to add something to that since you do the budget.
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Right now, Lori Stewart said that's helpful to know. Thank you very much. And I don't have any questions right now. We are at 4 minutes in. Ms. Avoyne says thank you. So yeah, we're at 4 minutes to 8. So if you want to do any summations or anything, this would be a good time to do it.
I think we need to close with just what Seth was talking about. There's a lot now as we kind of get the ball rolling again in the midst of the pandemic to actually get engaged in. There is the whole police interactions with youth, which is going to be a continuum process that needs a lot of that input to make sure we get it right. There's also the EPIC program that's going to be rolling out and open for public feedback, where we have to know, how do we make that program fit Baltimore? And the only way that we get there is through input, feedback, ideas, and comments from Baltimore residents. So I think now, as the nation kind of puts on a reform hat, that we need to focus on the mechanism that we have in place. Like the judge said, the Baltimore's path to reform has been signed and sealed. So let's make sure that they deliver and get involved, be involved, and stay involved. Anyone else have
Thank you,
anything to
Ray.
add?
No, I think that was a good closing argument.
Since the door, Cassie came back with, since the door is open, please share the distinction, the roles for BPD monitoring team. No, the role for BPDs, I guess, NLs and the neighborhood liaisons.
I think the role is the same. The employer is different. So
Right.
both jobs are to get information and receive information from the community. We kind of have more of the integrous approach because we don't work for BPD, but the liaison's job pretty much throughout every area is the same, to engage the community, to get that feedback, to kind of create those relationships. So the roles are the same. I think the only difference is they work for BPD and we're agents of the court.
Perfect. And that's why we have to maintain our integrity and our independence. And that's the only distinction. Okay.
Well,
Thank you,
thanks
guys.
everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
Remember, reach out to the monitoring team with any information, any ideas, any concerns, or just general feedback on today. We need to hear that. info@bpdmonitor.com, or visit our website and click the comment section, www.bpdmonitor.com.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.